Hello everyone. Abohar Urban Studio welcomes you all to the third talk of the series Shehar Conversations in collaboration with Studio Oriole and Municipal Corporation Abohar. Shehar Conversations is a step to explore the different facets of life in small towns of India. The speakers will cover aspects of urban growth, physical and cultural transformations of small cities, the aspirations of the youth, governance aspects and issues of social segregation of different communities in the city. It is with great pleasure that we introduce you to the speakers for today, Kanhu Pradhan and Shamindra Nath Roy. Mr. Pradhan and Dr. Roy are senior researchers at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Both are part of the urbanization team at the center. Mr. Pradhan has a background in economics. He has recently completed his PhD from IIT Delhi in internal migration in India. His current research looks at patterns of urbanization, interaction between rural and urban areas, and migration in India. He has also worked on issues around special economic zones, urban economy, and segregation in urban areas. Dr. Roy has a background in geography and he has done his PhD from JNU Delhi. He is currently associated with research related to migration, transitional urban areas, housing, and public services in urban areas with a particular interest in spatial analysis. Also, he is involved in projects related to COVID-19 and female workforce. Today, they will talk about urbanization beyond municipalities, patterns and discourses of census towns in India. Now I would invite Mr. Pradhan and Dr. Roy to take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Special thanks to Kanchanji and Professor Anuji for giving us this opportunity. We would like to share a presentation. Okay, I hope you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So, I'll just start with how the work on census town actually started in India. So, this concept of census town, this is something not new. Actually, the Census Register General of India it introduced this concept of census town in 1961. So the concept is very old, but for most of the years it was invisible. But in 2011 census actually one important thing happened. The number of census town actually increased by 3 times. So after that, actually a lot of media channels, newspapers reported about this change. At CPR, actually there are like few things from those new channels actually struck us. So it was about Kerala, urbanization story in Kerala. So first thing is the urbanization rate in Kerala. It was around 27% in 2001 census, but it increased to 48% in 2011. So there was a sudden increase in the urban population. But on the other hand, if you look at the bigger cities in Kerala, actually during this period, the population growth was almost stagnant, or in even bigger cities, there was a decline in population. So these two numbers actually, they are not matching with each other. On one hand, there is a rapid increase in urban population. On the other hand, your major urban cities are not showing population growth. So we actually started with some basic calculation for Kerala, and we realized that almost all urban population growth in Kerala is due to census town. Census town in the sense reclassification of villages into urban areas. So that striking result really forced us to expand that work to all India. So we did some work, and that was some sort of like major work on census town. After that, actually a lot of work has been done on census town. We have done some works, and other researchers around India also contributed to that debate. But in spite of those things, actually, I think I should not hesitate to say that our understanding about this topic is very limited. We don't know a lot of things. That is the history or recent history of whatever is happening around the work of Census Town. So yeah, I'll start with the presentation. So the structure of this presentation is something like that. We'll start with how do we define urban and rural in India, then how Census Town is important in India, and what are the broad pictures of the Census Town in India, and then we want to speak a little bit about whether the Census Town is something important to study or not, and then we'll talk a little bit about policy and conclusion. Okay, so this is the how do you define urban in India? So we have like two different definitions of urban in India. So one is from the Census of India, Register General of India. So the purpose of census defining urban is basically counting people. It has no governance implications. But the second definition is it's more practical, governance related. So in the census, we have three different types of urban areas. One is statutory towns, another is census town, and the third one is outgrowth. So statutory towns are all places which are notified by some laws. The laws can be state laws for various municipalities, municipal corporation, or municipality or town panchayat, or it can be any kind of central law for defining, say, cantonment boards. So the second type of urban area is census town. Census towns are nothing but simply these are rural areas by governance. But these villages actually they satisfy three different criteria. So the population criteria is at least 5,000 population. The second criteria is population density of 400 people per square kilometer or more. And the third criteria that is very important criteria is non-farm workforce. So the minimum male non-farm workforce criteria is at least 75%. So the third urban definition is something outgrowth. I think work on this outgrowth is very limited. These are basically villages which are close to your statutory towns or close to statutory towns, but they have urban nature in terms of infrastructure and amenities. So what is important from the census definition is that census town and outgrowths, these are urban only for counting urban people. They are governed under your village panchayat or rural panchayats. Okay, so this is a slide just to give you how census actually made these classifications. So basically they first, so during the census operation, basically they asked state governments to give a list of statutory towns and all the remaining villages. Then they apply the criteria of census town to villages and identify which are census town. Then they apply the outgrowth criteria to the remaining villages and then identify outgrowths. And the remaining villages remain as rural areas according to census classification. What are challenges with the census classification, or is there any kind of implications? First is while census identifies census town, the practice is that they use old census data to identify census town. So to give you an example, so all these census towns identified in the 2011 census, actually they are based on 2001 census data. So what it implies that when the actual data from the census comes, you will find that a large number of census towns actually they don't satisfy those three criteria or any of those criteria. Another implication is that there could be few villages which satisfy all these criteria, but they are not classified as a census town. So this is something related to how we identify census town. And the second implication is that all these criteria I have mentioned, these are discrete in nature. When we talk about, say, non-farm workforce, say we have two villages, one village that the non-farm workforce share is 75%, in another village, say it is 74%. So if you stick to the census criteria, actually the 75% village will be classified as census town, while the 74% will be classified as villages. While there may not be much difference between these two villages because of our existing criteria, actually they will be put into different types of urban and rural villages. Another implication is something, it's general to our rural-urban transformation, is that this rural non-farm, structure of rural non-farm, this is not something moving in one direction. So we cannot say that all villages in India, the rural non-farm is increasing. So research has shown that there are villages where the non-farm share is increasing over time. Then there are villages non-farm of course is declining over time. What does it imply that you so you can have a census town today which might go into villages in the next towns. So the non-farm is not stable over time.
I just add one thing. So what this basically essentially means that there is a lot of definitional jargons around it, and when we think about the larger perspective of India's urbanization, is that a substantial proportion, which will come through in the following slides, is basically contained in these discrete definitional jargons, and we don't have a very stable nature of urban growth that is at least definitionally there in the bottom spectrum. All these three kinds of stuff. So for example, the map here, which essentially shows that if you just take the size criteria and the density criteria that the census applies, it's 4,000 people and the 400% per square kilometer density, it just centers into Indo-Gangetic plain and some discrete parts of across India. So when you first start with a reductionist approach of like a small criteria like that, then your window gets already low, and then after that, these various other layers, the dynamic nature of non-farm participation kind of stuff comes in, you basically resort to a lower distance. So this arises interesting questions about what would be the better way of defining urbanization, which is another debate. But the point of implication is that when you see from the governance perspective, this instability across the rural-urban spectrum creates a lots of things. For example, even though census towns, which are basically towns as per census and not from the perspective of governments, they are used in various cases by the governments to calculate urban population of the state. And our major urban programs are often contingent to those kind of population. Now, when we have a not a very stabilized sort of movement going on at that level due to this definitional criteria, it often creates differentiations in urban programs, and it has its effect, which we will discuss later. So that's the message we try to give here. Yeah,
okay, so what is the broad picture of census town in India? Okay, so why census town is important? Because why it is important for us to study. So the graph on the left, basically it shows the contribution of different types of urban areas into total urban population. So just I would like to draw your attention to the third column, which shows the census town. So if you look at the 2001 census, the share of census town in total urban population was around 7%. But in 2011, actually this proportion increased to around 4%. So as already Shamindra has already mentioned, because in various government programs we use a lot about this number of urban population in state to allocate our resources to various states. So census town, actually the share of census town increased over time. And the graph on the right, it basically shows what is the share of migration into urban population, share of migration to urban growth vis-a-vis the share of reclassification to urban growth. We can see that the contribution of rural to urban migration is more or less stagnant around 20 to 25%. But when we look at reclassification means any kind of processes which in which we converting rural areas into urban area. It can be identifying rural area into census town, or it can be merging the villages into broader census, broader statutory town, even creation of new statutory town. All kinds of reclassification. Actually, this process is increasing over in the last years. This second point, I think something is that related to how our big city is growing and what is the importance of census town in these big cities. So what we say this graph shows that when we look at urban agglomeration, so urban agglomeration, it basically says that in urban agglomeration, actually the importance of census town is increasing over time. If you look at all years in India, so the contribution of census town to this urban agglomeration, it has increased from 7% to 12% between 2001 and 11. Okay, so this is a like broad picture of how many census town, how the number of census town has increased over time. So, so if you look at the figure on the left, we have official data till the 2011 census. So up to 2001, the number of census town, it was not very high. It was around, so in 2001, it was 1362. But as we know, in 2011, the number of census town increased a lot. So there are like 2,500 new census town added between 2001 and 11. So we don't have a data for 21 because the census for this recent 2021 census is not over. But we have actually written a paper on it because since the census uses old data to identify new census town, and we have 2011 census data. Actually, we can use those 2011 census data to predict the number of new census town for the upcoming census. And we realized that we found that we can have around 2,200 new census town in the upcoming census. So the point is that the phenomena of census town, it is something not limited to only one census period. We are expecting it to continue in the upcoming census as well. So the graph on the right hand side basically it shows the state-wise distribution of census town. So I have divided all census town into three different types. One is like old census town, which were there in 2001 census. Another is like present census town, which are in 2011, and another is upcoming census town, which we are expecting in 21. But one thing which is common is that these are limited to few states. The states like say, Kerala, West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, they account for a large number of census town. Also, we are expecting they will account for a large number of census town. This is the same point I mentioned. Basically, this distribution of special distribution of census town is limited to like few pockets in India. If you look at the central India, mainly states like Madhya Pradesh, actually the number of census town is very low. And something I think Shamindra has already pointed out how the nature of our villages, rural settlements actually affect this. So yeah, I think Shamindra, if you want to continue from the next.
Yeah. So so essentially, I mean, I'll just go back once the last slide ended. So basically, it shows that due to various reasons, the speciality of census town, maybe the definitional character, which is concentrated in North India, it is specially concentrated in certain parts. But within that, we can, if we want to really look deeper into the nature of these towns, their characteristics, the speciality, what we find, that's the next part of our presentation we'll be going to look at. So spatial characteristics. So why do we need to look at spatial characteristics? Because a lot of these things, if you remember the agglomeration slide Kanhu was showing, census towns are important if one looks at due to the economic footprints from various viewpoints. If we go through the literature, that they define these places as part of agglomeration economy, they define these places as isolated rural service centers. There's a lot of variation into that. So what we attempted to look at it is to make a schematic representation of the speciality in some of the work we have done. That if we need to really specially characterize the census towns, how pan-India basis, how does it look like? Now, I know that if you go down into a case-by-case sort of stuff, a lot of the definition may not fit or thing, but this is the most generalized sort of thing we can present here. What we basically did first here is that we differentiated the census towns in India into two categories, proximate and non-proximate. By proximate, which basically refers to the forces of agglomeration, census towns which have grown more over time due to the factor of a large city around it. Kanhu has a very complex methodology to do that. I'm not going into detail, but to summarize it, that any town that is growing within a specified radius of at least a large town of 50,000 or higher population, that's the proximate city. And the non-proximate census town is that anything grows beyond that. Now, within proximate and non-proximate, in the generalized scheme, we went down to see that if we find any further speciality. We found that within the proximate towns, we have certain towns which grow just near the boundary of the large cities. They seems to be very spatially characteristically different than towns which are not sharing a border with those large cities, but rather falls in the distance band. So we calculate, we tell these places which are contiguous to the city is a peripheral contiguous town. There are some towns, for example, if you go to Raipur in Chhattisgarh and you go to Bhilai, Raipur Bhilai is a complete urban conurbation. Within then you have a bunch of towns like this, or for example, one near to this, near Chandigarh, there are places like that where cities grow as spaces interstice between two the towns. We tell them interstitial cities. And the third thing is this non-contiguous places, but within the distance band, we tell them non-peripheral contiguous cities. And within the non-proximate towns, we also found there are distinct spatial characteristics. There are some towns which grows around each other. So one service center grows and around it a number of towns share its border, or there are smaller kind of statutory towns around it, places grow which has the border with it. We tell them clustered cities because they have a very different distinct kind of spatial pattern. And there are some towns which are completely isolated and grown as a local service center. So these things help us, all this detail helps us to provide a route map to look into the deeper economic and social dynamic of cities to see that if these things vary a lot or so. Before going into that, there are some statistics. We find that 33% of our all census towns that falls in proximity of million plus STs, and 49% in STs of 0.1 to 1 million, and 18% proximity of class 2 STs. Overall, it's 40% on average. We found that these cities, at least say a little less than half of all our census towns are growing due to the economic footprint of the larger cities. But what is more important is that more than half of this growth is also happening in the periphery of the larger cities, which is interesting for our perspective. So we say this first force, the proximate one is agglomeration, and the second is more of a localized urbanization. I will not spend much time in this thing. The thing that is important from displays you the this number that I told, that half of this are proximate and half of these are non-proximate. And what is most important is that the cities are not growing, the proximate cities are not growing only in relation to the big cities, as our studies say, that agglomeration effects are also there in case of smaller cities. And there are many more of these comments showed in earlier slide, that 2231. So we are going to expect two concomitant effects in the speciality of census towns over time. One is to the economic footprint of larger towns, as well as one is the more independence. Next year. So this is one of these localized things. So we knew about the agglomeration towns. But what about these localized and isolated towns? They are relatively understudied, and we thought that let's see what's happening there. So the first thing we looked at, where are they located? So a lot of these towns are around, we see that there are local economic functions, but they are actually located. There are two kinds of places. Number one, they are situated at local economic function areas like tea gardens of West Bengal, Assam, industrial mining areas of Jharkhand, Odisha. And second thing, there is a strong co-location with infrastructure as well. We see a lot of them, more than half of them has a very good relationship with highways and roads. So even if we see the spatial dynamics, we see that it has the manifestation on our low level of urbanization. The census town is multifaceted. There are effects of big cities, there are effects of highways, there are effects of local economic functions. So it's really variable in these cases. So now the underlying dynamics of these places are also different. I mean, qualitative studies have seen migration has to play any role. So if we go case by case, we may get 1,000 stories, but what do we see about the economic dynamics of these places if we see in general? Yeah. So one thing we see, let's see the nature of employment of these places. Here, this table is big, but I will just try to, so basically what it basically shows is, the first row shows what is the share of employment in each of these kind of towns that we have shown. And what are the nature of employment. So the first row, you see each of these places, what is the share. So we see that among all the non-farm employment there in these census towns, the largest chunk goes to the proximate for sure, but the isolated ones are also economically dynamic. They are not far ahead. So clustered at 30%, and which are peripheral and contiguous, very near to the largest cities, they are 40%. So there is not much of a difference. And what comes in if we see the structure? The structure says a very interesting thing. We see the manufacturing. Our normal idea about urbanization is that a lot of industrial urbanization happens in big cities, but we saw that that's not really the case. Census towns are good catchment areas of manufacturing. It's actually a very strong places. I mean, a strong place where a lot of workers are located in that school. So we see that, for example, places which are immediately near to the larger cities, they cater a lot of manufacturing workforce. There are 74% of the workforce in manufacturing. But what is more important is that the cluster towns which are beyond the larger city boundaries, they also have a very good amount of manufacturing workforce. So it says that there is a lot of variation. Now we need to go further to see that what is the nature of this manufacturing. We are currently working on that, but decoding that may give us idea about a lot about the larger economic catchment of these areas, what we actually talk about, and this whole debate around what is the nature of micro, small, medium enterprises in these places. So that's one finding. The second finding, we found trade. So we know that census towns work as service centers for villages areas. Case-specific studies work on that, but we see that for the isolated ones, which are far from any agglomeration effect, it plays a role. The third thing, we see that the small farms have a sizable share. So this again takes back to the essential part for economic dynamics, that we have a lot of manufacturing in small farms. Now, to compare it with the Chinese stories, that you also see a lot of things there. But the macro data at least says that what it was there in early 80s or so, a lot of that ingredient is present in the bottom spectrum of our urbanization already now. Mechanizations may be different and specific studies needs to be there, but the macro data points to that. The fourth interesting thing is about female workforce. What we found is that our female workforce participation rate is actually higher than the overall urban average in the census towns. Now we know that our urban female workforce participation is gloomy. We have only 15%, 16% of our women in urban areas who are working, but here it is 25%. So what are those? Are they household industries? Are they specific? We saw there is a single worker farm. So there is also sufficient catchment to find out that sort of story. These are threads that we are currently getting, but basically what it implies is that if one needs to dig deeper into the speciality and economic dynamics in relation to that, there is a lot to find out. So this leads us to the next part of our story, that are these places we saw that economically they are not a lot different that we anecdotally know about large towns. We have ingredients of manufacturing services in them. So they are also places where we have substantial consumer basis. So we don't have in India good data on wages or standard of living to work on this level of towns. So we saw that when we see there is economic dynamics, let's see, because Kanhu already told you in some of the earlier slides that these non-farm participation, whatever we see, is fragile. You don't have a lot of stability going on there. A place which is 75% now goes down to 70% tomorrow and so forth. So my question is that why that's not happening? Is it as we saw that there are single worker farms, etc., but we want to see that does it has any livable implications on standard of living, etc. We found due to the unavailability of data on wages, we couldn't proceed further, but we found that these places also show very well signs of prosperity. So in the left hand side, you see the nightlife intensity. Nightlife intensity is a proxy measure of GDP and economic activity that has been used. In very different kinds of these urban classes, we plotted them, and we see that if you see this middle at the line at in the median at the middle of these boxes, it shows the census towns have relatively higher level of, they are certainly lower than our official urban areas, but relatively higher level of economic productivity than these places. And if we translate them into the consumption pattern, we don't have also good data, but if we see motorized two-wheelers, for example, we see they also have a better number. So this right-hand side curves, this lot of curves, it basically shows the share of motorized two-wheeler access to in each of these places. The right, the curve head is, it refers to more percentage of people having it. We see the cities are way further than the normal villages than this. So they are also economically dynamic, and there are a lot of dynamism happening in there, in addition to the economic activity that is going on. So this leads to the next question, that what could the policy? These places, now we have analyzed this, we see that they are different than our rural counterparts, and we need specific policy prescriptions for them. But so far the reflection on state on this also two prongs. Number one is make them administratively urban so that they can get urban services, and or do sort of in situ development there, make them self-sufficient so that urban amenities can be provided within the rural governance structures. But that has certain pointers. So on converting census towns to formal urban areas, the statutory towns, government over the town has, so this is, as Kanhu already told, it's on state government. State government decide which census towns will get modified into statutory towns. But we haven't seen a lot of STs are coming up over time, and there are also reluctance over space, because the binary pattern of rural-urban governance across these spaces has always created, there is a larger lot of debate that our development paradigms are very much focused on rural areas than urban. And a lot of development expenditure in form of social security, for example, Narega and kind of stuff, they go to rural areas. So panchayats also have larger level of financial empowerment than the towns, smaller towns. So those things basically create some sort of resistance in converting these places to STs. So basically what we see is that a lot of confusion among people and the state comes from this dichotomous governance structure across the rural-urban spectrum. And census towns which fall in the middle of the trap of it are basically fall certain sorts of gray areas into that. Now, if we talk about converting cities into STs, so we try to see that if this conversion makes sense. So there are two complex graphs, but I will just explain them. The left one shows that in terms of nature of services, if we look at the census towns and statutory towns, there are differences. So the left graph shows that cities which have better investment in improved sanitation. So we see that at the right hand curve, cities have substantially better private investment in on-site sanitation than smaller statutory towns. What it essentially tells us that people do a lot of private provisions there. So when government says that we are going to transfer into an ST, of course the natural resistance is going to come because we already have a better private provision of all like that. So why will we go and pay taxes? So when we talk about this kind of policies like convert them, we need to keep these things in mind that the nature of private investment in services, because census towns are economically different than villages, we have seen economically productive than villages, it also differs in, so that in some cases they are different than smaller statutory towns. So if I want to make, say, a census town of 10,000 people into a 10,000 ST, it is bound to not get any significant improvement, at least in terms of toilet, which is a privately provided service in many cases. But if we come to public services, we see cities are not very different. So I took here, or we took here as in-house drinking water, which is a network service again, or this thing that shows that there is sufficient scope of improvement on that, because this comes from the factors that because some of these services are not possible to provide at the rural governance level. So now we are embarking into Jal Jeevan Mission, where government is basically trying to provide pipe to water connection. So this picture may get changed or not changed in next 3-4 years or so. But so far there is a difference in terms of public provisions between these things. So if we see from the public amenities perspective, cities need specific attention. So the bottom line of these things is that when conversion of this kind things into the mind, we need to keep into see that cities have very specific demands where conversion can work and cannot work. The next pattern is in situ development. So there is another thing, we have an urban mission, Shehar Prasad Mukherjee urban mission, which tells that gives urban amenities to rural areas, keep cities within the Panchayat Raj system, but provide them with some basic facilities through which they can be more empowered in terms of services. So that is important, but again we have shown in last time those services needs to be very specific. So for example, we have seen in the last graph that there is a lot of private investment already in terms of improved sanitation, in form of septic tanks, in front of improved pit services. So you may not need to give pipe sewer to them in all cases, but you may need to provide efficient septage management to them. So those specific requirements needs to be kept in mind when you talk about in situ development. So in the right hand side graph, what we have seen is that we took peripheral areas of these mega cities, Bangalore, Delhi, Kolkata, Mumbai, and we plotted how census towns look in comparison to the other areas in that. We see that even in those peripheries, in terms of nature of services, and the services are pipe, sewer, and treated tap water, both of which are network services and can be easily provided from the core city to the peripheries, they differ a lot in terms of in comparison to the other cities. So in those spaces, network services is a possibility, but in case of more isolated perspective, when there is a lot of private provision already done from people, we need to look at different sort of attention to look in terms of that. So when you talk about in situ sort of development, there are need for case specific or fitted for purpose intervention. So what do we know? I mean, we talked a lot about temporality, nature of census towns, what could the policy. So we understood the cities are rural non-farm hotspots. We see that they are relatively affluent from the rural neighborhoods, but we don't know much. These are some of the questions that we want to pose that can be used, but we don't know much that the stability conundrum. We see that a lot of them coming in and going back, but why that is happening? Is there a wage instability? Is there a nature of job instability? This leads us to interesting questions because these are important catchment of our economic geography. We saw that what happened during COVID-19 reverse migration. A lot of people came and a lot of debates happened that do these places have the capacity to sustain people in the long term? And we know at one point of time or cross-sectionally, the capacity is there, but in temporally that the capacity is there, can it sustain in the long term? So if you look at state governments repercussion during the COVID reverse migration, you see a lot of them are saying, well, a lot of people are moving out of the state because they don't have jobs in their spaces. Now we will create jobs, but are those jobs already there, and are we not looking at the right direction to make these jobs more sustainable? We have already seen we have a very strong manufacturing base, we have a strong MSME presence, we have a strong female workforce participation rate, but still we're seeing that there is a lot of instability. So why it's happening? That's the number one question we want to pose. The second question we want to pose, that what about the regulatory capacities? Cities are important in terms of manufacturing, some of them are services, commuter destinations, transport, but we don't know enough about their specific regulatory capacity. Do they have any, or don't they have it? We know there is a mixed governance conundrum in this case. Some cases they are directly under rural governance, some cases in metro areas they are governed by parastatals. We don't know the comparative perspective performance of cities under those different governance domains. So that's another important question that we can follow. The third important question we can look at is there are more research in terms of how agglomeration works. So we saw that proximity cities have a very structurally different, not really structurally different, but a higher share of manufacturing and a different sort of economic base than the others. But we don't know, for example, that what are those economic activities and how are those shaped with the economic activities with the cities they are near to. So when we say agglomeration, are those agglomerations being created due to congestion diseconomies to the larger space where they are situated, or are there more in situ but happening due to the large cities already there and they have the transport network, etc. So the decoding the nature of agglomeration and that proximate growth could be the third question. The fourth important question is the process of asset creation. I mean, this is more important in case of the isolated census towns and which are growing beyond the agglomeration peripheries. There are a little bunch of stuff are now coming out, literature on this, but we don't know enough, and we need to really look at that. There are various models already at present. There are return investment in agriculture, there are return investment of economy from return migrants, in trade, in building activities, in rural housing as an asset creation. But that is another important way where people need to look around, because asset creation is important from the perspective of also governance, that coming in so all this debate that we're talking about, that the definitional instability, that how government should look at this, how government should govern this, and a lot of people's mandate matters there, if they want or they does not want, and a lot of that power comes to how the economic dynamism works in terms of asset creation. So we also need to know a little about that. And fourth is, we don't know about the aspirational perspective of these towns. I mean, when I say we don't know, I refer to the macro studies. I'm sure a lot of studies in your case and in the qualitative spaces are happening. But at the pan-India level, we don't know about what are the aspirational stories in these towns. Do people need better educational opportunities, or are there places where these are migration catchments? What are the role of factors like education that may better the facilities of this space? Are some of these towns are stopgap spaces where people come and go to larger urban areas? So in those spaces, how things like education related migration studies work? We don't know about the larger aspirational stories about this. The second set of thoughts are on policy. We already told that there is a two-pronged policy, and we don't have any specific policy program now for cities. But for cities, we have National Urban Mission. It's not specific, but it follows a cluster-based approach. What it takes is, it takes a cluster of villages and look for a more regional sort of view, which we find from our spatial characteristics may work for census towns, but it not only works with census towns. That good, because we know that cities are discrete, and any places that shows potential but don't bother for that 75% places can be taken into account. But we also need to know about that what are the places that they're actually working with. Also, this kind of programs that are going on to support this kind of places are forms of VGF or viability gap funding. We don't have a lot of programs that are dedicated to it, but we have a lot of convergence schemes. So the way the financial model in these places work is that you have several programs going on at the panchayat level or the parastatal level, and these things comes as a critical convergence funding to build across them. So we need to look at that, is that a sustainable financial model for a lot of these places. The next important part is important. We have very compartmental functionalities across rural urban domain. So we all know that our panchayats and urban areas, panchayats are governed by 11th schedule and urban areas are 12th schedule, and there are very specific duties and particularities are there for urban areas and there for rural areas. And but census towns transcends those compartmentalities. For example, if we take transport, for example, intermediate public transport sort of places, they need regulations, and panchayats don't have any say on that. Building regulations, panchayats don't have a lot of say on that. So those regulations across some of these critical sectors, that needs to be flexibilized to govern cities. So financial model and schemes are one, but we also need different functional view when we talk about governance of cities. Functional view in terms of compartmentality and functional view in terms of coordination. Why coordination? Because we already seen that a lot of them are proximate, and we need to really reinvent some of the roles of some of the defunct things. DPCs, NPCs, district planning committees, Professor Subramanian has a lot of work on it. So all these places, how this work, how parastatals govern them. So coordination is another, and these are more on implementation stage, but also at a larger scale, we also need to look how we design schemes. Implementation of schemes is one problem, but our schemes are now designed across rural urban binaries. We don't have a fit for purpose approach. So we have VGFs at one hand, and we have strict rural urban schemes on the other hand. But for cities, what we need is flexibility. So, for example, if we have Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana going on, and we have a bunch of census towns which are contiguous to a large town, and we don't have a PMI rural funds for them, but the state needs to have flexibility to spend PMI urban funds to them. So the design of these things, and we have a precedence for that. I working with social one thing came into mind. So Ministry of Women and Child Development has this working women's hostel, which is a fascinating scheme for migrant women and labor employment opportunities for migrant women. So they don't work across, and you can find them everywhere across this. So these are some of the examples, but in terms of our critical kind of stuff, infrastructure development, we really also need to look around the binaries across this. This is a need of an hour. Thank you. I mean, it was long presentations. Yeah. This is our paper that we wrote last time, and if anyone wants to look at it. Hello.
I think you have mute. Yeah.
Thank you both of you for sharing such insights from your work and about the census towns and how important it becomes to study them, to study the further growth and growth patterns. So now we are open to any questions or comments or any conversations. So yeah, from the audience.
Hi, I'm Nancy, and I want to know about that you told about the role of migration, right, in economic perspective. So I'm more interested in the physical urban planning, but when you talk about the migration, and it's mostly happening in Himalayas like Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh areas, and when we talk about urban planning as well, right? So how can we adjust like economical activity with physical urban planning? Like if we want to develop a Himalayan region as an urban city, like if we thought about Dehradun or like other cities, and there is some Himalayan mountains, how can we manage the economic activities with planning? I'm not very sure if it's relevant, but it's kind of question on my mind. If we planning, then economic activity is the one of the most important aspect. So
Yeah, so I mean, I mean, in terms of, so specifically in terms of if you see larger towns, etc., census towns don't have a lot of planning functions by they don't, it's not defined because they're governed by panchayats, etc. That, but for the cases of these towns, we think there are a lot of factors that play work here. So when we talk about Himalayan areas or hills, I think the first thing that is completely ignored in a lot of us is a question of environment and how it works in terms of physical planning. Now, if we look at the migration question, there is a whole bunch of work on where migrants are hosted in larger cities. In fact, today we were discussing about one paper on housing where people say that the nature of this organic growth pattern that is happening, our reluctance to regulate or that pattern leads to several kind of informalities that basically refers to migrants. And when we talk about actually migrants, we need to, I mean, Kanhu can take a good thing here since you're migrant cases. Migrants cases, there are a lot of differences. So if you talk about immigrants, if you see the kind of circular migrants, so people who are multi-location who come and go in the city, they need a very different sort of prescription in comparison to the long-term migrants that come. Small in terms of circular migrants, etc. I think rental housing or those kind of stuffs needs to be focused more in comparison in relation to large or aspirational migrants sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So
I'll just start something. So this is not related to this result, but also not related to Himalaya region in per se, but it's like all India level. So there is something actually I found somewhere else is when you talk about the smaller towns, smaller in the sense not like mega cities, something like 1 lakh, 2 lakh kind of thing, the migration pattern is very different from bigger cities. So one pattern I found is that the nature of migration is basically people from neighboring villages would come to the city. They want to stay there for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, want to develop some sort of network or improve some skills, and they have a higher ambition to move into bigger cities. So in that case, I think when we talk about managing migrants or even thinking about migrants in cities, I think it would be better like how can you like do something so they can move easily into the next destination, like into bigger cities. So maybe like affordable rental housing, say even skill development for them, or like providing better information to them. I think these would be very useful in this kind of medium sized cities. But this is something not particular to Himalaya region, because I think I don't know but any much about the particular region.
So nature of physical planning and the migration question is a complex question. It's a good question actually, but before that, a lot of planning depends upon the nature of migration you are facing. So, for example, if I so it's a migration that it's a source region, or it's a major destination region, or it's a region which is intermediate where people come study and go for further sort of stuff. So depending upon the main sort of thing, you need to imagine how things would work out. If we talk about affordable rental housing in larger cities, for example, those have very good intentions, but at the same time, one needs to look that if that is located in the periphery of the city kind of stuff, or if there is not enough incentive to take those. People will, of course, then go to informal housing in the center of the city to stay there. So I think nature of migration needs to be decoded first to look at what specific sort of basic expressions you need in terms of time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well,
We have Mr. Abhijit Kaplish with us, and from Abohar, he is Commissioner MC Abohar.
Hello, hi. So I'm traveling, so this might be slightly, I don't know if you can hear me correctly. First of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation, and it was actually a delight to see the detail in which somebody was talking. And so a couple of quick observations, and then I have one small question to ask of you. So yeah, I mean, even in our work here in the administration, we've seen a lot of towns which were previously converted into urban areas or declared as nagar panchayats, but then subsequently there was a demand to turn them back into not gram panchayats, but not shahri areas, but actually Grameen areas, because of the various schemes of Government of India and this differentiation in the funding patterns, etc., of Grameen areas and urban areas in particular. But and that's a persistent thing that I'm seeing across Punjab. Along with that, there is also the observation, and I would also take this opportunity to maybe send you that article. I had written that article and I'd shared it with the Anu ma'am also, in which I kind of tried to show that there is in general a funding, so the funding patterns are skewed towards larger cities in general, and not just towards the discrimination is not just against census towns, but also against larger cities in general, because these larger cities are also larger urban areas with more service class and industrial areas, which are also to larger taxation, and hence they get bigger shares of what the government imagines to be an urbanization of the country in general. Now, with those couple of questions, the question that I want to ask you is, the policy framework that you laid down was very interesting, but is there any state in India in particular which is dealing with this question seriously and trying to make a serious policy change as far as census towns are concerned? Or is this debate as of now limited to the academia only? I mean, that would be my question. Is there anyone who's seriously looking at redoing it, redoing the as you said, the 12th schedule limitations, or trying to redo the way maps are laid down for urban planning, or as you said, how the state defines how master planning is to be done, and things like that. So, like, is there a state that stands out and is doing good work in that sense? Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, three things to rehash, as you correctly pointed out. Number one is there is city falls in the transition areas, and one hand we have rural, one hand we have urban. So the functional domain of the cities, which needs inputs from both, are currently not present. So this creates confusion among people who are living there, that are we going for best or worst. The second is also depends upon the nature of services that we have sought. So if you think question of public services or something, where you need tap water connection, etc., a lot of people say we want that, but some will say that we want to pay or not incentive. That's a different question. But if you think about livelihood, etc., you don't have the flexibility to provide jobs at urban areas. So it's also the nature of benefits that you get that has an effect. So this too creates a lot of confusion in the popular imagination of across this conversion. So there are several ways to deal with it, both at the union government level and the state government level. The state government level is what can be definitely done is flexibilizing the 12th and 11th schedule, because these are size insensitive in nature. You don't need specific things for big cities and small cities. So you can basically mix that thing up, and you can do it across this thing. And for the second stuff, we need this rural urban binary to go, because people does not have to deal with the confusion across. If we will not get the NULM thing at urban area, and if we shift to the, or you are getting Narega in rural area and not get to urban area. So these things can be flexibilized a bit for cities. So at both level, there is a requirement, because the scheme design, etc., needs to be done at the union level, and the implementation, flexibilization should be done at the state level. So it's not only the on the onus on states to do these things. It's a combined effort that rather needs to be done. Coming back to the state level, we have not really did a very detailed stuff on that. Any state is doing that, but I hope Kanhu can better talk about that. But states have very different criteria, and there are no uniformity in dealing with this question. So, Kanhu,
so yeah, this is just, I think there is a instruction from the central government that states should make cities to STs also in one state. I realize they are like telling we want to convert all cities into STs, but those kind of prescriptions sometimes I think these are problematic. We just don't want, like, we have 5,000 census towns, just make all 5,000 into STs. We need to be careful about making these kind of statements, because each of the census towns, their character is different. Their ability to raise fund, even making decisions is need to look them in bit detail before making any kind of decisions. So it would be better to understand them better rather than just make these are very very, I would say, something not relevant prescription.
So, I mean, from the state's perspective, a lot of their interest comes from the economic imperatives. So, for example, if you see, they are more interested in the proximate towns that we have shown, proximate cities. And the first thing that comes into mind, make a parastatal and make a metro area kind of stuff, and provide them directly under this thing. That doesn't leads a lot of functional flexibilization at the grassroots level, and that keeps on creating confusions across the mass. So that is one interesting part that I think the states needs to go beyond this economic imperatives and need to look cities as a separate entity. And I think there is no conscious attempt that I have seen to look cities as a separate entity rather than seen as a supplementary entity to the larger towns. So that's the problem, I think, that comes into the picture. So we don't see conscious attempts from states regarding that, as far as I know.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
We have Debashri. She raised her hand. Debashri, you want to ask something?
Yes, thank you for such a great presentation. So, sir, I had a question regarding the amenities that you were mentioning, that panchayats without census town and panchayat with census town has performed better in terms of the service provision. So, does that particularly have any implication for programs like Jal Jeevan Mission? Because, I mean, if you look into the overall program scheme where the village level has to make a village water supply schemes, and then block levels rural water supply scheme. So in particular for panchayats which has a census town, the better performance, is it due to some kind of spatial or advantage that they have, that they are sort of delivering the service better than in case of any isolated villages? Sir, I mean, with respect to like schemes like maybe National Rural Water Supply Program or Jal Jeevan Mission. That's the question I had, because you showed with panchayats and without panchayat cities.
I don't think they look at, I mean, our academic interest, we looked at cities in this fashion, that cities with panchayats are any different from cities without panchayats. But we also didn't check if a panchayat has a city, what happens to the other villages in that panchayat. But I don't think when government rolled out the mission, they have very consciously looked at it. I mean, what you are basically implying is that if there is a strong base already there in those places, and if you need a different sort of, which is an interesting question. I mean, if I, for example, if I already have sufficient septic tank coverage or water supply coverage, piped water supply, I may not need a lot of resources there. Rather, I need resources in operation and maintenance in those places, or I will probably empower the governance in that particular space to do a good operation and maintenance, so that I can get sufficient quality of water supply and uninterrupted water supply over time. I don't think the programs which look very quantitatively to the aspects takes these factors into account, and that is one thing that increasingly came up in our studies, that you first need to do a real strong assessment that what is already there and design your program as per that. I don't think is currently there in the policy. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Kanchan?
Yeah. So my question is about the spatial distribution of census towns. From that slide that you showed, the state-wise distribution, I think West Bengal and Kerala had the highest. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was intrigued that both had kind of communist governments. And, is that somehow related? Like, I think West Bengal resisted industrialization, that Nandigram episode happened. And so, I mean, how is it that census towns are so rapidly coming up in West Bengal?
It's a great question.
I think it's a difficult question to answer, but one thing I can tell you, something might be useful in this aspect is the settlement pattern in West Bengal and Kerala. For Kerala, at least I know this average size of village is much bigger. So it is not difficult in Kerala for a village to satisfy 5,000 population criteria, but that 5,000 criteria might be difficult to achieve in another state. So I think it is more with the characteristics of state rather than any kind of, I think, political affiliation.
Yeah. So of course, I mean, if I go back to that map to the beginning, to Kanhu can you show the map once more? I think a lot of answer lies in that map. That this large dense. So when we say census towns, we need to remind in mind that they are only one form of these spaces, and the larger political dynamics that works with a lot things. But if we go back to this large dense village map, we can see a lot of these dark spaces are there in Bengal and there in Kerala. So by default, this discrete criteria leads to a satisfaction of these three things, and a lot of census towns showed up. And specifically, these two are one of the highest population density states as well. So this thing, and also if you look at West Bengal's pattern in general, West Bengal had a large chunk of these towns growing around as proximate cities, around Kolkata, around Siliguri, these clusters. And the second chunk of this growing around the highways, the National Highway 34 that connects North and South Bengal, basically. So those factors are there, but I think that the one thing that needs merit is that to go down maybe in some of these towns and look at that how this. So for example, in case of Bengal, there is this really nice paper came out in World Development Journal of Robin Van Dujin and these guys. They basically looked at the Murshidabad and Malda, these districts. And what they found out is that remittance plays a big role. So West Bengal resisted industrialization. You have a large pool of out migrants going into relatively high wage states, and they send back financial and cultural capital back, which basically leads to circulation in these cases. So those are interesting facts that can only come out in terms of specific cases. But if we look at the very macro thing, we think for Bengal population density, the agglomeration effect and the highway effects are the most important part. And in Kerala, the generic settlement structure is also there. The classic Desakota model that we see in Indonesia as well. Kerala also had that. I mean, there are large fisherman villages which are connected towards it, and over time they basically came up as big villages and automatically qualified as census towns. So that is there. And Kerala also incidentally have a lot of remittance economy that we all know from the Gulf, etc. So it has a big role to play in both cases. But we really didn't study the political dynamics of it. So, but I think that the migration, out migration and the remittance question to somewhere remotely link to the processes of politicization of industrialization in some of the states.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments? I think that's it. So thank you, Kanhu, and thank you, Shamindra, for such a great conversation. And thank you for joining us, and thank you all.